teaching. So this morning, I'd like to speak a bit about a story in the Lotus Sutra, which we've taken up as a central text for this practice term. And the Lotus Sutra is quite a long sutra. This is one of the English translations of it, and so it's kind of a foolhardy thing to take up the study of the whole sutra for a practice period of 3 months. But one thing we do very well at Buddha I would say, is foolhardiness, and so that's what we've done. Really, my hope is that people will develop some kind of relationship with the Lotus Sutra. That may be that you're just coming for Sunday and listening to some talks, maybe even just one time, and you'll receive some teaching from it, or maybe you're reading the sutra, or you're coming to Thursday night assemblies, hearing teachings on it, working on it with teachers, etc. But one of the beautiful teachings in the Lotus Sutra is that any of those really are a complete path. That our job is not to try to decide which one of those is the complete path, but to trust that all of those ways that we're studying, practicing, receiving teachings, putting them into our lives in some way, that all of them have a real significance. They all have a real importance. And this is one of the central themes, we could say, of the Lotus Sutra. So it's very fitting that when we're studying the Lotus Sutra, that you are thrust into a situation in which you have to confront that. Right? That, here's this big sutra, I don't know anything about it. Well, actually you do. And what you know about it is very, very intimate. And that's what it is you need to pay attention to. Very, very personal, we could say. Now, one of the things that sometimes goes unnoticed in our orientation in a spiritual practice is what do we imagine to be the meaning of the spiritual path? What do we imagine to be the context or the relevance for the spiritual work that we're doing? Especially, I would say, with Buddhism in the West, many people come to Buddhist teachings as seekers of one kind or another. And we may not be totally clear about what we're seeking, but we know I'm seeking for something kind of better. I want to get my life together in some way. I want to respond to a deeper yearning to live a spiritual life, or to live a life that's aligned, or we might say, I remember when I was in my 30s, it was really important. I said, I want to live a really full human life. I don't want to waste this thing. Right? And what is it for my life to be full, engaged, doing everything that I can, burning cleanly, so that there is not so much residual soot and smoke, but that I'm doing something that I believe is important. So how do we imagine, or how do we contextualize what it is when we receive a Buddhist teaching and we put it into practice in one way or another? If that's meditation, or that is a certain kind of study, or certain description of how reality fits together, all of these different things. We need sometimes to step back and think about, why is that important? What's its meaning? What's its significance? One of the reasons that teachings don't only come in the form of instructions in how to practice, how to live, etc., is because of this. You can get instruction in meditation, for example. You can come to the temple and you'll get very fine instruction to meditation, introduction to meditation, kind of transmission of what is it that we are taking as the central practice in this school. That's good. You could go on YouTube. You could find 500,000 different instructions about how to meditate. I'm not saying that's not important. It is important. And to hone our understanding of what are the methods of practice, whether that's meditation or other kinds of practices, this is important. But it's very easy for that kind of knowledge or that kind of instruction to overshadow this other question, which is like, what's this about? Who are the cast of characters? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? And to move just from a kind of ambiguous sense of inspiration to a deeper rootedness is part of what happens as we continue to pay attention to the teachings and to integrate them into our lives. So instructions and even explanations. A lot of sutras are very, very many pages of explanations, which, being a very capital explainer myself, I appreciate, but also becoming more and more and more aware of the limitations of that. It's a habit really to explain. I've been learning that a lot, spending time with my grandson Kai, who has inherited his grandfather's explaining mind. So we were just spent a little time at the coast together. My mother-in-law's here from Japan, and so we wanted to spend some time on the coast, and we went to the aquarium yesterday, and everything was really nice. It's so fun to be with him. He never stops talking. He's 3, and most of his talking is explaining. And there's he speaks only Japanese right now, a little bit of English, but there's for those of you who speak Japanese, these sentence endings that are like dayo, dayo, dayo. So he'll say, "Oh, the octopus is swimming in the tank, dayo." Then the dayo is like that's how it is. It's a thing you put on the end of that's how it is. And he loves to just tell you how it is. Yeah. And then every once in a while I'm like, "Hey kid." But anyway, it's a kind of habit. It's not a bad habit. We're mapping the world constantly. And part of whether you're like Kai or like me, where you're a kind of person who likes to language that out, to say it, or to say it inside of your head, one of the advantages of being a person who has the habit of verbalizing is it's easier to realize you're doing it all the time in your head. And when you're not a person who has the habit of verbalizing it, you could probably get by with the idea that you're not doing it. But I guarantee you are. The dayo, the dayo, the dayo, 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 dayo is in your head constantly. When you think, oh, this is how it is, this is how it is, this is how it is, this is how it is. So those explanatory teachings are in that mode, but has a real limitation. How things are is a little bit different than asking yourself the question is, why does it matter? And so this is one of the reasons that the teachings in a sutra like the Lotus Sutra take the form of stories. So stories really about all kinds of significances, all kinds of meanings of what the Buddhist path is about. Stories are a great way to provide that way of study in which there isn't just one meaning to things, but the meaning comes out according to the reader of the story. Whoever's hearing the story will hear something a little bit different. Just like anything, really. But that dynamic, the Lotus Sutra takes up as being a primary thing about practice. That of course you will have your own significance for it. You must. Actually, every being must have their own reason, their own meaning, their own significance of the teachings of practice of living. But that those, we shouldn't think of them as being set against each other. That they're actually all about the same thing. They're all the same story, but it's a story which is lived out through many, many, many different lives. Now, the story I'd like to focus on this morning is one of the famous stories of the Lotus Sutra, and it comes in chapter 4, which is usually translated as Faith and Understanding. That's the name of the chapter. And what happens in this chapter is just before that, Shariputra, which is one of the Buddha's closest disciples, who is a renunciate. It means he's given up all of his worldly possessions and family connections and everything to follow the Buddha in part of the renunciate community. He's what it would be referred to in the Lotus Sutra as a Shravaka. A Shravaka literally means voice hearer. So there's a class of people who are studying the Dharma, the Shravakas, that are called Shravakas because they're close to the Buddha and they're listening to his teaching. So voice hearer, that's what Shravaka means. Shariputra is like the echelon of the Shravakas. But he's still a Shravaka. So the Lotus Sutra tells us that there are also these Buddhas, which are called Pracheka Buddhas. Pracheka means solitary. So they're Buddhas that are awakened, but they're just awakened to themselves. And they don't realize that their awakening is connected with all beings. That's another kind of follower of the Buddhist path. And then there are the Bodhisattvas. And the Bodhisattva means a being of awakening. The Bodhisattvas are beings that are walking the path to Buddhahood. Okay? So the Shravakas, their place where they end up is as an Arhat. If you're like Shariputra, you're the top of the top, you become an Arhat. An Arhat has dried up all of their worldly desires, and they've extinguished the flame of suffering. Totally calm, really present. So in this chapter, right before chapter 4, Shariputra is told by the Buddha that actually he will also become a Buddha. He's not stopping at Arhat. He's going all the way, okay, to the Buddha. And in this case, what a Buddha means is a being which will awaken in a world and will become the light of awakening for that entire world, of all of the completely uncountable number of beings that will be in that world. Shariputra will be their Buddha. And the Buddha tells this to Shariputra. And then chapter 4 comes. And in chapter 4, Shariputra's buddies, Mahakachayana is one of them. We don't hear that name so much. Mahakashapa, you hear that a lot. Mahakashapa is here on the Buddha's left side. He was said to be the first ancestor in the Zen lineages, and then passed to Ananda and down through time. And then Mahamudgalyana, which some of you will hear the stories about him saving his mother from being in a hell realm, etc. And Subhuti. So these four, and Shariputra, are the echelon of the Buddha's Shravaka disciples. And so in chapter 4, they say, oh my gosh, we've been missing something. The context which we had, the meaning which we had, the understanding of what we had about what our spiritual practice was that we were arhats, that we were shravakas, that would practice very hard, and we would get to the place where we learned to extinguish the flame of desire and suffering, and that was what our work was. And what you have just told us is that Shariputra is actually, who's just like us, is actually destined to become a Buddha. And this blows their mind, right? They just don't have, they said we couldn't have even imagined. And then they tell this story. And it's a kind of parable. They say it's as if there was a man who had a son. This is very similar to the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, but also quite different. So if you know that story, or if you've been schooled in that, you can listen to the story and see where the differences are. Don't just map the Bible story onto that happens a lot. People say, oh yeah, it's the parable of the prodigal son, but it's quite different actually in some ways. So he says it's as if there was a man who had a son, and they parted ways, and they both traveled to other places. And the father, on his travels, because he was a very trustworthy person, he was trusted by many people, and he began to accumulate wealth. And in fact, over a period of 50 years, he became unfathomably wealthy. He was like a king. He was, and the sutra goes on and on about all of his wealth, how many conch shells he had, and how much gold, and the banners that adorned his palace, and all of those kinds of things. So he becomes very, very wealthy. At the same time, the son doesn't fare so well. His life is difficult, and he's traveling from place to place, and he's picking up work just to survive. And so the father keeps thinking about his son. Remember, this is a story that Mahakashapa and the others are telling. They're saying, this is what we feel like. And the father's been having this longing for his son. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He's come across all of this great wealth. And when he dies, where will the wealth go? How will it be utilized, the sutra says. This can be a difficult part of the story for us because we're like, you could just give it to all the poor people, right? That's one way to understand it. But you have to get into the mindset of where people were at this time when the story would have been told. That actually, how do you utilize wealth? You utilize wealth through the system that was there, which was landed, wealthy people, kings, etc. Whether, we probably don't want to go back to that system, but that system was there. And so he's asking himself, how will this wealth get utilized and not just squandered? If it's just sort of, if there's no one to inherit it, it will just become squandered. So he's thinking about this all the time. And it just so happens that the son is traveling, and he comes into the town where the father lives. And he comes across this assembly. It says the father is sitting outside of his front door with all of these adornments and on many of his advisors and things. I imagine he's kind of looking out, off his front porch at the beautiful world. And the son comes and he sees him. And the father recognizes him immediately, but the son does not recognize the father. And so the son says to himself, this probably isn't going to work out for me. Power hasn't seemed to really favor me. And if I'm around here, someone might grab me and put me to work against my will or some other thing. And so he starts off. And the father sends some people to get him and bring him back. And so I think he sends 4 of his guards to go and bring the son back. And when they come to get him, they say to come back and work for our master. And they grab him and he faints. And they bring him back and they're kind of like, okay, here we brought him. And the father realizes this isn't going to work out. He's not ready for this. He can't really deal with it. And so in the sutra is an interesting image. He says he just sprinkles cool water on him. And he doesn't wake up. He sprinkles cool water on him. It's not to wake him up exactly, but it's a nice image. And then he has the guards go to him later when he wakes up and say, you're free to go. And just at this, the son is like elated. Oh, I'm free to go. Even that is like a light in his heart, freedom. And so he goes, and the father thinks to himself, okay, I have to devise a plan. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hire a couple day laborers. I'm not going to tell him anything about who I am or who this man is, his son. I'm just going to say, what I want you to do is go, I'll pay you, go to this man and hire him for double the standard wage and ask him to come back and work with you, and you're going to work in my estate. And so they go, they lay out the deal. He says, great. He comes back and he starts working in his father's estate. He doesn't know he's his father, right? And the father's watching this and he sees that he's working, cleaning up the filth. This is the sutra I keep saying, cleaning up the filth. Different translations of what the filth is, but let's just keep it at filth. Okay? So he's cleaning up filth. And the father will see him doing this. And at times, the father will take off all of his wonderful clothes, put on a kind of dirty robe, smear some filth on himself, and he'll go and he'll meet the son. And he'll work with him. And sometimes he'll say, you have to work harder. And sometimes he will say, oh, you're so good at this work. You're taking care of this, just as if you were the person who this belonged to. And over time, the son gets better and better. And he says to him, I will give you anything if you ask for it. If you need a cloak, I will give you my cloak. If you need some food, if you need some salt, that's one of the things. We think just salt, right? It's like everywhere. Not exactly, right? But this time he says, I will give you salt for your food, and a long list of things. And so over a long period of time, the sutra says 20 years, the son comes to be able to handle all the accounts of the father, and yet he still lives in the poor hut that is outside of the estate, and he comes there each day, but he's capable of taking care of everything. And then the father comes towards the end of his life, and he says, call this man, and he brings him, and he brings together all of the people of his retinue, and he says, this is my son, and this will all be entrusted to him. And there's a kind of celebration. So this is the bare bones of the story. There's more detail in it. If you're studying the Lotus Sutra, I encourage you to go read it, because a whole bunch of little things like the sprinkling of the water that don't necessarily make a lot of logical sense in the arc of the whole story, but they're super meaningful if they're meaningful to you, right? There's this texture to the story, which as you encounter it, it might light something up in you. So it's really important to pay attention to all of those little details. So then this group of Shravakas, they say, this is just how we feel. This is how it seemed. We followed your direction. We've done everything you've asked us to do, and we've led a holy life. And now we can see that the context is not what we thought it was. We were actually carrying out a much bigger mission than we thought. We thought we were here to take care of business, the business you told us about, which was people are greedy, hateful, and ignorant. And we're going to squeeze that out of ourselves, and we're going to help other people squeeze it out of them, right? That's what we thought we were doing, but actually we were doing this much greater thing. We were taking care of a treasure. We were taking care of an inheritance, which now you're saying is what our work is. And then the next chapter, the parable of the medicinal herbs, then the Buddha says, yeah, you got it. That's right. I am like, this Dharma of the Buddha is like a rain, a Dharma rain. Some of you practice at Dharma Rain Zen Center in Portland. That's where their name comes from, Dharma Rain. Kind of a nice catchy thing for Oregon, right? So the Buddha says, this Dharma is like rain that falls equally on every being, just like the rain falls on a forest, and every type of plant, every type of tree, everything that's growing in that forest takes up the Dharma in their own way and utilizes it in the way that is significant to them. So that's kind of the package of the story. Now, one of the classical ways that this story was interpreted, particularly when people are trying to understand what is the Mahayana, or the great vehicle Buddhist teachings, they emphasize that there is essentially not a difference between the Shravakas and the Pratyeka Buddhas and the Buddhas. These are known as the three vehicles, and the Lotus Sutra teaches the one vehicle. That can be spoken of in three ways. Okay? That's a core Lotus teaching. So a lot of times people, when they hear this story, that's what they pay attention to. And that is a good way to pay attention to it, especially when you're thinking about what are my tendencies? What are the ways that I think about practice? But I would also say, if we just stay in that kind of relatively narrow interpretation of what's a Shravaka, what's a Pratyeka Buddha, and what's a Buddha, then we'll miss this other possibility of the story that these arhats tell. And again, it's a story about context. It's a story about significance. Why is the spiritual practice that you're doing important? What's its meaning? What's its significance in your life? Part of what this story and the story in the chapter after this are telling us is that's not something to try to divide out outside there and then get into yourself. That's not something that you need to seek to find out there. Doesn't mean there's no effort, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it means that when you're in that kind of mindset, like I've got to find the right widget, I've got to find the right instruction that will give me the right technique to meditate in the right way so that I could da-da-da-da-da. There's a time and a place for that. But there's also a time and a place for this other kind of conjecture. Why does this matter? And if I can get a sense of why it matters, I can find my way back to this one vehicle teaching, this teaching in which no being is left out, including myself. One of the organizing stories for us, typically speaking, in Buddhism in general, but I'd say particularly in Western Buddhism, is this kind of dichotomy or conundrum of effort. Are we working to be better? Or are we already of the nature of Buddhahood? We split those two apart and they become irreconcilable to us because of a kind of misunderstanding. We say, well, if I'm essentially good, then it's not about trying. It's just about waking up to my essential nature. Sounds groovy, huh? No? Wake up to your essential nature. Great. Don't try too hard, or else you probably break it. That's totally true story. But when we start believing that story, we think like, well, why am I sitting still for so long? It's not that easy to do, right? Why am I coming back up against these difficult things? I would say for many people, if they come into an alignment of spiritual practice, you find a lot of problems. Right? You might come because there are a lot of problems, and you think, oh great, I'll do this and the problems will go away. But then your problems maybe become a little stronger, or a little closer, or you just realize, I thought they were farther away than they are. You know, they're actually right here in the way I'm thinking about the world, the way that the way I am. So this already good and the working, that tendency to pull it apart. Right? Now, if the story is we've got to work hard to achieve some better state, then how easy it is to get mired in self-criticism. I'm not good enough. I tried and I failed, so this must not be my inheritance. All of those kinds of ways in which it's very easy to turn from the possibility of a path of transformation because the working better or working harder at things to get better at things isn't exactly working out. And it's very easy for us to fall off the path there. So one thing I love about this story is it takes these two and it brings them together. It says, yeah, all of these Shravakas were completely heirs to this immense wealth of their father. But the father didn't just say, hey, no problem, kick back. You don't need to work. You don't need to learn anything. He realized that was just going to send him into a coma. Right? Now, he passed out in the story, right? But there's a lot of ways we pass out. And usually it's not like becoming inert. We pass out and we do a lot of stupid stuff. Right? That's the way we usually pass out. Right? We go mindless. We start being really senseless in how it is we treat ourselves in the world. So in this story, these two are harmonized in a way. Say to have that inheritance is really everyone. Everyone the Buddha cares for in that way. But that's not actually a story of letting you off the hook. That's a story that says you have to learn to care for the accounts. And it starts with cleaning up filth. Right? And but that filth is contextualized in a different way. That's actually what Buddhas do. Notice in the story that the father is not like, that's what the workers do. I don't do that. He puts on the old cloak and smears something on his face and plunges in so that he can meet his son there and teach him and work side by side with him in this effort of cleaning. This father, who's this kind of symbol of the Tathagata or the Buddha, is right there cleaning along with him. That effort is necessary. The cleaning is necessary. But the cleaning isn't necessary because you're not good enough. The cleaning is what Buddhas do. It's what Bodhisattvas do. It turns out it's what Buddhas do. It's what Shravakas do. It's what everyone who's on the path does, is say, this is maybe diluted, but it's also natural. We don't have to hate it. We have to actually do something different with it than to keep it locked in my idea of its external, some external nature. Now, I'm oftentimes teaching that one of our really deep spiritual works is to work with our regard for things. So when I'm teaching meditation or teaching meditation at this temple, we try to emphasize it's not just about how clear you can get your mind, or like how attentive you can be, how concentrated you can be, how mindful you can be. That's not just like a quality of how clear is the windshield, but it's actually how are you regarding the things that you are seeing? With what mind do you see them? With what heart do you see them? Is that a heart of divisiveness? Is that a heart of greed? Or is it another kind of heart? And what does it take for that other kind of heart to be active? What does it take for me to see things in this other way? When we sit in meditation, one of the first things we're faced with is what's a regard for this body, this breath, this mind. Because oftentimes we sit down quietly and, whoa, it's quite a vessel, you know. It's got all kind of things. Some joyous and some difficult, and lots that are just sort of neutral, but there's a lot to notice there. Right? What's your regard for it is a practice of meditation. Not just, do I see it clearly, as if I could wipe everything away, then I would see it in a certain way. Do I regard it as being another plant in the forest that's receiving the rain? Or do I only see it as something I need to get rid of? That kind of concentration is a concentration of innumerable meanings. It's a concentration, a samadhi, a way of seeing that is about all of the beings in the world and their luminosity, not just kind of beating this thing into shape, so to speak. How's that in your life? How does that matter for you? That becomes part of what the study's about in a textual sense, in receiving the story, but then also in the practices that you're doing. Are there any questions or comments?
This is exactly where I'm feeling skewered right now.
Hallelujah.
And it's in that regard for being, and that I realize it's why all the in the verse version of the burning house, but all of the not just difficult beings, but beings that are being destructive and hurtful on purpose.
Yeah.
Like, what is it to regard all those beings that are difficult for me as Buddhas, that doesn't try to erase how they are manifesting right now?
Yeah. So this is a little bit of a kind of I don't know, esoteric type teaching, but well, let's see how it goes in a little more exoteric way. So I love this story. It comes from Prajnaparamita tales about this ogre who was just super hungry for the Dharma. And he really, really wanted the Buddha Dharma. But he's an ogre. He's a person-eating ogre, right? That's what he hangs out in the woods, and travelers come by and he grabs them, snaps them in two, and roasts them and eats them, right? So what he figures he needs to do is eat sages. He's like, I want the Dharma. So what do ogres do? They eat sages. You know, that's what he knew. Now, ogre is a terrible affliction, to be born into that life where that's all that it is that you can see. But one of the reasons I like the story is it's kind of funny, and there's pictures of him with these like sage in his belly. It's kind of like sticking out. But if we kind of play with that image a little bit and don't just think about the externalized ogre, but also the ogre that's right here, there's something about it that's asking us to get closer to our own ogre nature, our own kind of very rough idea about what it means to progress on the path. And it's in that place where if we can see more our own tendency, our own unskillful, grasping, difficult tendency, and the way that has helped lead us on our own path, that those things, you know, they're not good in an ultimate sense, but we're trying to scratch the itch. And in that trying to scratch the itch, even there's something that kind of brings us forward. Sometimes people will talk about it. I believe it was those of you who read the introduction to the Lotus Sutra piece that I distributed on Thursday. I think he goes into this a little bit. In a way, all desires are kind of desire for nirvana. Because if like, let's say you really want some ice cream. No, let's have pizza. I'm feeling more like pizza. You really want some pizza. In a way, the experience of eating the pizza is delicious, and especially if you take some time to learn to savor pizza. So good. But you're kind of aiming for the satiation of the appetite for pizza. The satisfaction is a little bit more what we're aiming at than the pizza itself. And so there is this line of thinking that says, in a way, all of our desires are pointed towards this kind of satiation. They're pointed towards wanting to be satisfied, wanting to just be, simply. But the problem is that we misunderstand and we grab onto it in this certain way, and we think it's about the pizza, rather than just practicing the satisfaction straightforward. Now, everyone does that. That's not a story about people who are bad. That's a story about people. So when we're working with other people and we get more in touch with our own ogre nature, then we start seeing that. It's not that, even when people are doing things like purposely to hurt other people, there is a motivation for it that is related to this path in some way. And that's what we're trying to relate to. And that's why we say a Buddha's job is to see living beings as Buddhas. It's not to paper mache a Buddha over top of the ogre, right? It's not to try to just wash everything away and love bomb everything and pretend like it's okay. It's actually to get into that nitty-gritty place and to realize actually every living being has this desire to be at ease. And how do I relate with that? Because that will become a Buddha. Without question, is what the Lotus Sutra tells us. And it's that little kernel that every being has, even if they're, an ogre of some sort. Now, I've just given you an explanation, which you already know, and I realize the actual doing of that is impossible and excruciating in certain instances. But it's also brings such a different ease to things when you can meet people that way. And when we do, we can really see transformations that are remarkable. I would say in my own experience, the people I've met who are seem like they're bent on creating the most harm, it's not hard to see where that came from. No one ever saw them like that. No one ever saw the at-easeness of their heart. And so, of course, all they can do is break stuff. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's easier for them to clean up the filth. But. Do you know these robes? These are called robes of patience. That's what the kesa or kashaya means, patience. Kashanti is the word we use also in practice. Yeah. And they get filthy too.
Your son?
Uh-huh.
My dog Pablo is very, very sick, although he's better. This is a result of being given a medication once a month for his arthritis. I generally my habit is to research every drug, B or whatever. I trusted the vet, and I'm really stuck because I did that. And so it's not that I'm angry. I could be, but no one did anything intentionally. The vet practices are all owned by corporations. So it's a corporate model. Anyway, I don't want to go into that. But where I'm really stuck, and I'm not blaming myself, but I am responsible. So every time I see his head twitch, or him not be able to jump up on something, or him drink excessive water, all of these are the result, including kidney disease now. I feel, like I cannot believe I let this happen, that I didn't research this drug. Had I done that, all the information is there. And I hold myself so deeply accountable for this because I have a certain, I guess, internal standard. So I've been listening carefully, and I feel like I sort of am okay to be stuck in this sense of responsibility. I don't want to, I don't want to rationalize it away. That's what the vet's doing. They're rationalizing away their accountability, and that really is not my thing. So anyway.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you're not fine, but you're in the right place for practice. I don't mean here, although it's pretty good, but in yourself. But I would say one place to pay attention to when we ask for the expertise of others, do we trust them to do their best, or do we trust them to give us the best result? And those are not exactly the same thing. So when we go to a doctor or we go to a vet, what I want to do is trust that they will make their best effort. And I don't want to judge the result, which oftentimes in hindsight can seem obvious. The number of this was actually really hard. There was one person from the Sangha, I didn't know them, who sent me an email and told me all of the things that are obvious about why leukemia treatment is toxic when our daughter was sick. And I was like, who would do that? But anyway, to this person was totally obvious. Look, it's all there on the internet. That this is what happens if you take this. But a way that I could rearrange myself, I trusted her doctors to do the best they could. And they are faced with all massive amounts of information about how to walk the best path. And if I was going to trust anybody to do their best, I wanted to trust those people, because they weren't just going on the internet and reading some stuff and saying it's this or it's that or whatever, right? Their whole life is dedicated to this. And so I don't say it's so clean as that. You can just be like, well, I can trust the vet was doing their best, and blah, blah, maybe they weren't. But in our own working with anger that may arise from these kinds of things, to get clear, was I just relying on them to make everything better, and I trusted they would make everything better, or did I trust that they would help navigate this thing, or they would navigate it for me or with me, to get to the best place we could? And if I feel like that's broken, that they weren't really doing that, then we have to respond in some way that is really that is clear. And anger, although it could tell us a lot about where we are in relationship with it, and that can be really helpful, my experience is rarely very helpful for the undoing of the thing. But there's something that's way more effective, which is like serious talk. And will they listen to that or not? You can't say for sure, but you've got to get clear about that point. If it's just about, well, my dog's sick now, what the hell's, why would you do this? Then that doesn't work.
Bill, there's been conversation. There's been acknowledgement. This is obviously happening.
Yeah. And so that's a place where your intuition to not have a problem with being stuck is really helpful, because being stuck in that place is like actually there's something to do. It's not just, well, I'm going to wait a little while and the feeling will go away. That's not the point. Yeah, there's something else there.
Thank you.
So sometimes ogres need to be stopped.
Yep.
Where does that sort of motivation sit alongside being knitting? Like, where does that sense of action, what do the teachings say about where that sense of need for action is best sort of originating to be effective?
So the origination is, it should come from the motivation for the awakening of that being. So if it's simply to stop the ogre, then that's one level, because if the ogre doesn't stop, they probably won't wake up. But usually we do it the other direction. We say, well, the ogre, among all of these beings, the ogre is the one that's doing the bad stuff, and so it's not fair to the other beings that the ogre is doing this, so we need to stop them. and everything starts piling more towards whatever kind of weapon we're going to use to control that being based on their being. They have excluded themselves, and they more and more become obviously evil in that pattern of thinking because they're doing these bad things, and the more that I resist them, the more they do the bad things. And so now you're left with a scenario of, okay, well, we're going to have to kill the evil ones, to make it work for everybody else. But the Buddhist, generally speaking, the Buddhist mentality is just the opposite of that. This isn't good for the ogre. It's not good for everyone else either, right? Actually, the sages that's pretty good. You get eaten by an ogre. It's not awesome, but also you have many lifetimes of, there's no negative karma for you to get eaten by an ogre. It might have been an expression of negative karma from a past life when you were an ogre, that you needed to get eaten by an ogre. This is kind of Buddhist perspective, right? So it's like actually what we want to be the more central organizing thing is, how is this ogre going to wake up? And what kind of conditions would be necessary for the waking up of this ogre? And that's a really different thing than this other kind of exclusionary mentality. Now that has an incredible strength. If you think about movements for various kinds of justice in our society, for example, people weren't saying, how do you get rid of these people? They were saying, how do we all start seeing with this different eye? That is an imperative, that we start seeing with this different eye. And I think that gets confused for us very, very, very quickly. Yeah. And it's not like people oftentimes think, well, that's just an idealistic and weak position. No, from that way of thinking about it, you could also build prisons. You could also have all of this apparatus, social apparatus, to contain people that are doing harmful things. But it's not just about protecting the public. It's about protecting those individuals as well. And what a different system would be there if we thought about things in that way.
I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, opposition to Hitler, and he decided as like a devout Christian to be part of a crew to try to assassinate Hitler. And I'm curious if there's that's a kind of direct action to, I guess, save the sages, because the sages will benefit society, whereas this other one is, harming society. Is there...
Yeah. So the Buddhist perspective, there's a famous story of the Buddha in a previous life in which he was a sailor, and he was on a ship with many other sailors, and there was a person who came on board who had the intent to kill the whole crew and take the ship once they had gone to sleep. And it's said because of the Bodhisattva, this was before the Buddha became the Buddha, this was the Bodhisattva, because of his sagaciousness, was able to see this. He was able to have the intuition that was going to happen. So in this story, the Bodhisattva kills the man. But his justification is, for me, in my position, to kill him is karma, and I will take the karma gladly. But not to save the other 49, to save him. With the kind of messed up mind he had, if he had killed all of us, all 49 of us, he surely would have burned in hell for uncountable lifetimes. And so I want to save him from the action that he would do. Now, these kind of stories are always trying to put a very fine point on something. It could be both. You could be trying to save the people and trying to save them. But if you talk about where is the center of organizing principle, in this case, the Buddha is saying, I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't let him inflict that kind of horrendous outcome on this boat because he would not be able to be saved. And my dedication as a bodhisattva is the salvation of all beings. And so that being's included. But he needs to get incarnated. And maybe being killed by a bodhisattva, that's the future Buddha, will have some positive, some kind of positive karma to it. So this is just a kind of different mindset, But to do that is very, very difficult. And at what point, in this, if we talk about taking on powerful leaders in in certain places. I remember a number of years ago when I still considered myself an anarchist. I read a book on the incredible effect of assassination. And the foreword to that book, I forget the author, they said, you know, the story that the power elites want to keep going is that assassination doesn't do anything, someone will just come in and take their place and do the same thing. And they said, if we look at it historically, this is not the case. Actually, killing really bad people makes a big difference. Not always for the better. They weren't making the case that it always makes everything better, but it actually massively changes the course of history. You can't really know how it's going to massively change the course of history, but it will massively do that. And I wish I hadn't read that book. Because you know, through my years, I'm like, you know, maybe there's a place for that, and maybe I'm the person. You know, I do think about that, but again, in all seriousness. But I think it's important that we understand what it is that we're doing, and how our stories, if I come back to the basis of this, how the stories or the context become very, very important. Is my story going to be, you have to fight hate with hate? I just don't see how that ever finally can be victorious. There has to be something else. And what is that? And that's a deep Christian question. It's also a deep Buddhist question.
I've been becoming increasingly aware, kind of coming on the heels of this exchange, of what I thought is anxiety. It is anxiety, but it's also rage, right? And a way that my reactions to what's happening right now is kind of, in some ways, making things feel easy, and it really feels super tied to my personal karma, and a kind of wanting to go back, Bonhoeffer, you know, I mean, just like, I guess my question is, it feels like to burn clean, I need to find a very strong way that I'm not utilizing now to work with my karma, so that I'm not just kind of like, oh, here's my karma, and I'm going to act it through.
Tell me more about the karma.
Oh, it's just Hitler. It's just the Nazis and the Holocaust, and just carrying the guilt and the violence and the victimization and victimizing of the Jews. And you know, are you on the side that is annihilated, or you can be the annihilator?
Yeah.
And I can feel like I'm not drawn into imaginations of, you know, assassination and violence. I'm drawn quite the opposite toward nonviolent resistance, but I'm feeling this kind of fieriness that I know is my karma.
What would you resist now?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Like just anything in particular. What's happening now with this would be the thing that you feel like is becomes so activating of a karmic sequence. What would be an example?
The passivity and the sense of comfort. My own sense of comfort and complacency.
But in the face of what?
That's a big question.
I mean, Trump sucks.
Yeah.
But so, like, what like on the ground? What's happening? What's happening on the ground that like gets you riled up?
That horrors happen and Americans are like, you know, going to Target. And so it feels just
But
like...
that didn't start with Trump.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's like I can feel this fire that is just coming out of a kind of karmic thing that is time travel-y. That doesn't do anyone any good, I don't think.
Well, so the reason I'm asking about what's on the ground is I think that a lot of where people's sense of burning right now comes from is justified, but also is fairly narrow. And so what I mean by that is there's a way in which our own, whatever side we think we're on, is very activated now, because if that side was a liberal side, it lost. And there's a whole bunch of things that are happening that, to what extent are they simply beating on my facade of what I think it means for liberal America to be what it is, or can I actually identify the concrete things that are happening that bring all of that karmic stuff to the fore? And so what I'm seeing in our community, I mean, not just at the temple, but in our maybe community in Eugene in general, is that I don't think people are very clear about the difference between those things. That one is a kind of general sense of course I have moral superiority, I'm a Democrat. Like, that way of thinking is actually pretty strong. And that the kind of karma that people feel is getting kicked up is related to that. I'm not saying there's nothing to be afraid of, or there's nothing to actually do anything about. I'm not saying that at all, but that is part of the place that just keeps us going to Target, or Capella, or Market of Choice, or whatever kind of place, you know, that you shop, and maybe have some story about that's why that's a good place to shop. Right? That kind of general ambiguous feeling about how it is that we relate as humans, and that I know what's right, I think is a real trap. And I think it's part of the reason that that people with very aggressive power ideas about how to organize the world are gaining favor because of that dynamic. So I'm not saying that's what's happening with you, but the reason I asked you about the specific thing is because if we want to go into like what is really the pain of this thing, or I'm in this kind of ambiguity, I think people need to work on clarifying that. So if I told you a thing that I am outraged about, is that my family now is experiencing people taking photos of them in the parking lot of places like Target and sending it to ISIS because my family's not white. That makes me really mad. And what's my response to that is something much more than a kind of ambiguous sense of difficulty. It has to be about cultivating a deeper certainty about what my own action in the world is. And that's where I see the Buddha Dharma really brings us to, is seeing more deeply the relevance of those particular things, as opposed to living in the kind of smoke of a general dissatisfaction that then gets poked. You pay attention to the news, anything you see, and it pokes you, and you're like, I see. It confirms my suspicions, etc. Does that?
No, I think you're ranting at something that's different than what I'm saying, but
no.
But I hear it. I mean, I think more anon, and
Well, let me see if I can make the connection there. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what you're doing, but what I'm saying is that when we have a generalized sense, especially when it brings in very humongous historical, and for you personally karmic, really for all of us karmic, but you in particular karmic knots from something like the Holocaust, when we bring that to the front and center, how often people talk about the Holocaust in just a sort of general way to reference anything that someone is doing that they think is wrong. And so what I'm saying is, where do I think you need to get clear is how do you speak into that space and not into the generalized milieu of kind of moral superiority, which I think is where a lot of people are hanging their hats right now, which then comes along with a lot of anger because we're not holding power. But when we're holding power, it's like, oh great, who deported the most people ever? Does anyone know?
Obama.
Yeah, it was under Obama. Yeah. So that's just like a little fun fact of like, check out what the whole power structure is, right? And so that's my answer to you is that if you want that fire to have a place to go, you're not going to find it in the kind of generalized ambiguous cloud of indignation, because that's not differentiated enough to actually deal with the karma. It's just another sort of self-placating process of living in this disambiguated sense of moral superiority. And that if you want to speak into the place that's like, no, this is, let's get clear about it, then you have to use that karmic circumstance to help you develop the clarity. You can say, this is something that is activating that in me, and it should, because it connects to a real, a place where I have responsibility.
What's time?
Okay, one last one. Here, yeah.
Okay. I was thinking just so much along those lines last night of like, what is it actually that's making me so mad? And this image of Elon Musk with a chainsaw. I mean, if you just take one's image, put it on a sign and show up somewhere, you know, it's actually kind of like you've distilled it down into something that is gonna help you express that specific, you know, I think in some way there's a way to get us out with our messages, whatever they are, as long as we try. And my great grief is that I don't have the skills. I can't do anything, you know. And I'm pretty heartbroken about not being a, you know, a person who can change things. And, you know, just, I totally recommend what you just said. Take that message, get specific. See if it fits on a sign about this big and show up somewhere, you know, because if we, there's this almost element of passivity that I hear that we can't, I don't think we can go there, you know.
Yeah, so I hear that, and a couple of things I would say is, one, believing that you're a person that can't take action is a good thing to recognize, that you have that belief about yourself. And then you can say, well, what do I want to be? Is that what I want to be? Do I really not have a capacity to do something? Or is there some karma there that's just simply holding me to a position of the idea that I can't, that I don't have any choice? Where's my agency there? And that's a thing to work on. By work on, I mean not just try to force it in another direction, but try to understand more deeply why you have that kind of deep belief. Because in the unlocking of that, you might find that there's all kinds of agency which you have, which you don't feel like you have right now. So that's part of the medicine. The other thing I would say, there's a lot of ways to write something on a sign and to put it out there. I personally don't think that in this environment right now, I'm just totally just talking about myself, that all writing that on the sign and going to the federal building and marching around or whatever is that effective. I personally don't. So I'm not likely to do that. I'm not likely to write that message on the sign. But in my life, I have a lot of contact with a lot of people. I have a lot of work in which my clarity about that sign then comes into the way that I'm meeting those people. And I think that's a place where I have a lot of work to do. And from that, movements may emerge. From that, different ways of responding may emerge. But for me, I think that what can feel really good is like when Trump first got elected and we all put on pink hats and went to the federal building, and that felt good.
Yeah.
And I'm not even saying it wasn't important. I think it was important in some ways. But I would also say that becomes so magnetizing to our mind about what revolution is about that we can miss that there's another kind of revolution which is not so glossy, and that one is actually, I would say, more important, because it's going to be the foundation of these other things, and that's where I'm putting my effort right now. But that has to do with my agency. What do I feel like I can do? And not just what I can do, but what I want to do. What I believe in is that. And I'm not saying that anyone needs to believe that same thing, but you better believe something.
Yeah.
And probably you don't know what you believe. And so that's where this kind of spiritual work leads us to understanding, what do I believe? And if I could see more clearly about what I do believe, I have this chance for some transformation. And that's societal. That's where social transformation comes from. It's from the center, and I believe that. So that's where I work.